time in history where you would have three major books on civil-military relations, taking different approaches, I would offer, coming out at, more or less the same time, and probably very good timing, I would suggest, because it is an interesting era. And I also am very pleased because each one of these panelists are, I would consider friends. I'm not sure if they want to be identified that way, friends of mine, but and not just recent friends. These are people who have really been involved with the military and civil military relations for many, many years. And these are not, and I think here's a prediction from Dunlap. We're going to see some Johnny-come-latelys to this subject who will be turning out, quote, books about civil-military relations in the next year or so, whose names will be completely unrecognizable since they just thought of civil-military relations yesterday. But unlike that, we have some real experts here. I'd like to start the conversation by asking what motivated each one of you to write your books? Rosa? Rosa is like one of my students who suddenly she tried to avoid eye contact.
I did. Well, Charlie, thanks for inviting us to take part in this. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. I wrote my book for all the worst possible reasons, but it's a reason that those of you who are academics will understand, which is to say that having spent my pre-tenure years dutifully writing law review articles that nobody read, except possibly the student law review editors, I then got tenure and I rashly proclaimed in a blog post, I'm not doing that anymore, it's stupid. And all my colleagues thought this was not a very wise thing for me to have said. Well, I'd just gotten tenure. I waited. But then the years went by and I became more and more embarrassed and red-faced because of the fact I was not publishing gigantic, long, heavily footnoted law review articles that no one would read. And the dean said to me, maybe you should write a book. And I thought, yeah, book, I'll write a book. That's what I'm going to do. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And then I told so many people I was going to write a book over such a long period of time that shame eventually propelled me to actually write it.
I thought you were going to say money, but...
So Warriors and Citizens actually came out of an argument Jim Mattis and I were having about American attitudes about the war. And Jim was postulating something, and as is our wont, I disagreed with him and told him, look, you have had the same boss for 42 years. You've never interviewed for a job. You have no idea what a 50-year-old nurse in Columbus, Ohio thinks about this stuff. And one of the Hoover Institution's donors was in the conversation with us and said, why don't we find out, right? Why don't we find out what Americans think? And Jim and I got really interested, started looking. There had actually not been a large-scale survey of American public attitudes about the military since the one done by the Triangle Study done in 1998. So we got really curious about how 15 years at war might have changed America's attitudes about their military. And we went out and asked Americans what they thought. And I'm sorry, I left off the other big piece of it, which is that we then, because we're even shadier academics than Rosa is, we went out and asked people who we learned from on civil-military relations. Jim and I, because we disagree on so much, we separately made lists. And everybody who was on both of our lists are the people we asked to write chapters for the book. And I'm delighted to say nobody that we wanted to teach us turned us down.
Yeah, actually, Rose is in the book.
Yeah, she wrote a very good chapter for the book.
Kori did pay me.
I have to do this.
Oh, boo.
And I have to say,
I was in the Air Force, and we have drones, so...
I have a 10-second clip on my phone of the last 10 seconds of that game the other night. Charlie told me there's an AV problem, and he couldn't put it up on the screen.
Yeah, permanent one.
I'll have to just, I also want to say on that last second shot, he called bank. All right, I'm over it now. My book was actually outlined on my hard drive for about 20 years, and it was a matter of finding time to get around to doing it. And during the 20 years or so, we lived through quite a lot. The focus of our book is called Soldiers on the Home Front, so it's the domestic side. And it's really it's a lawyer's book. It's written for lay people, but it's about the law that governs civ mil on the domestic side. And so much happened, as you all know, in the last 20 years, much of it post 9/11, but many things even before, going back just to, Los Angeles riots and then Hurricane Katrina and things that were Waco, far removed from the counterterrorism emphasis. So that was why, and then eventually, wrote a proposal and got a contract, and then you got to write a book.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Let me ask all of you, maybe starting with you, Bill, if you were writing the book today, is there anything in there that you would approach differently, change, whatever?
We'd probably talk a little bit about the Trump administration, because there have been some interesting things going on in the last year. I was here a year ago, as you know, Charlie, talking with Peter Fever. Mm-hmm. And at the time, we were talking about some of the things that candidate Donald Trump had said. Witnessed this morning's conversation about our TJAG's panel on whether you could implement an unlawful order. He was saying he was going to have people do certain things that clearly violated the law. So, those kind of discussions would clearly be part of any such book now. Hopefully it was campaign rhetoric, and we're going to settle that all back down and move on. But that would certainly be taken into account. I think that's the most important difference.
So I would probably advocate us adding a section about why it is politicians hide behind uniforms so much. It was one of the big things that came out of our research, the increasing incentive on the part of political leaders to have uniformed officers making the case for their policies. And that is conditioning the public to the military having a much more political role than has traditionally been the case in American civil-military relations, and that I, and the Secretary of Defense, believe is healthy in American civil-military relations. So, for example, there's been a lot of attention on so many senior retired military folks serving in cabinet positions. First, I would remind you, President Obama had as many in his cabinet, and nobody was worried about that. But second of all, there is a tendency 40 years into an all-volunteer force for the public to, as Rosa so nicely pointed out in her chapter in the book, to have an enormous amount of affection for our military and an enormous amount of ignorance about it. And that's not a particularly healthy conversation. I was myself a little bit, I realize it's bad for the country, but I was a little bit hoping Mike Flynn would stay in the White House because he was the perfect antidote to that problem, right? Because so reckless, right, that it would cause the public to realize that our servicemen and women, our fellow citizens, our neighbors, they have better professional education than most of their civilian counterparts, especially on issues of strategy, but they are also not comic book heroes, nor are they victims. They are three-dimensional human beings and deserve to be treated as individuals.
Rosa, would there be anything that you would change about your book?
I don't think substantively. I think I might have, if I had known then what I know now, I might have added an extra dollop of urgency to the sections where I talked about some of the sort of dangers lying ahead on rule of law issues, but I don't think it fundamentally would have changed.
One of the things that, and Kori just brought this up, is that it seems pretty apparent that the American military is very highly respected. Surveys show it's the entity in U.S. government in which people have the most confidence.
By a factor of 2.
Sorry?
By a factor of at least 2.
By a factor of at least 2, especially in an era when, like the Supreme Court is going down and other institutions. Rosa, you worked in the Pentagon. You have a couple stories in your book that I think are very interesting to illustrate that even within government, even within people that you would think would know a lot about how the military worked, that wasn't always the case. You want to share that with us?
Sure. I remember there were a couple of different incidents that I've written about a bit, and that stood out for me at the time. I was working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working for the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michelle Flournoy, and one incident was I was sitting in my office, and the secure phone rang. There was only one person who ever called me on that secure phone. Most people just had normal phone conversations on normal phones, but this it was a guy on the NSC staff who only ever called on the secure phone, even if all he wanted to do was say the meeting is going to be at 3 rather than at 2:30. And he said, this was during this brief moment where there was a sort of a crisis in Kyrgyzstan. There was ethnic violence, and there was some anxiety that it could escalate quite rapidly and turn into a real ethnic cleansing kind of bloodbath. And he called up and he said, we're really concerned about this at the White House, which was totally understandable and appropriate. So we've got this idea, which is, we were thinking we should get a drone over Kyrgyzstan to see what's going on. And this was not a totally dumb idea at all, right? That U.S. Surveillance assets have, in other times, including during Bosnia, et cetera, played a really important role in being able to locate things like mass graves. And if you see the truck full of soldiers and it's going from place A to place B, that may tell you something really important about what's about to happen. So this is not inherently a bad idea at all. But what he said next, he said, so, and I said, oh, that's interesting. And he said, so could you, tell CENTCOM to get the drone over Kyrgyzstan? And I sort of said, I don't think I can do that. And he said, why not? This is really important to the president. And I said, the drones, they're sort of busy. They're doing other stuff. Like they're, I don't know, they're in Afghanistan. There's some issues about airspace and about which drone and who and how and is it legal and opportunity costs and that have to be worked through. And he got really irritated at me because this played into, I think, unfortunately, a trope that already existed, which was the White House perceiving the Pentagon as just trying to stonewall on every issue, and you don't care about human rights, and why are you being so intransigent when it would be so easy for you to help us? And he got very annoyed, and he said, look, I am calling you from the White House and telling you, this is what we want to do, and whatever happened to civilian control of the military? And I said, you're the wrong civilian. But I mean, there's another story which maybe I won't tell
because Christmas card list shorten a little bit.
I think he's still mad at me. But I think what it highlighted for me, and this was a smart guy. This guy's not a stupid guy. He's very capable in a million different ways. But what it really highlighted for me in some ways, and it was typical. There were many other smaller and larger episodes like this. This was a small one. Was just how little even very smart, very competent people who are civilians often know about the military. Just this sense of it's all this one big homogeneous thing, and you can just kind of say, military, get that drone from there to there, and it's not, on some level, it's not their, on many levels, it's not their fault. Like, why would they know? I mean, I suppose you could say when you get to the NSC, you have some duty to, but there's no point in the sort of typical path of a civilian policymaker unless they happen to go into jobs where they are working closely with military officials. There's no particular reason they would know, and I'm sure many of you sitting here have your own stories like that. But it sort of shocked me because I guess I would have always assumed prior to that if there was any place in America where you would not have layers of civil misunderstanding, I guess I would have taken it for granted prior to that, that it would be at those sort of upper decision-making echelons in the national security world in D.C., and the degree to which so often policy debates kind of foundered on the shoals of just total mutual bewilderment. And I could tell some stories about, on the military side, people being kind of baffled by, what, you mean you have to care about politics? That's what, that doesn't make any sense to me either. But that sort of mutual incomprehension of both, how the systems work and what might be the issues that people have to grapple with before things happen, and, what is the chain of command? People, just a lot of ignorance.
Kori, what did you find in your studies? I think I know, but I want to, about the knowledge of American people, and does it really matter? Two questions from that. One, should we be concerned? And if we should be, what can we do about it in a nuts and bolts fashion?
Yeah. We spent a whole lot of time on that question. So the level of ignorance should rock you back on your heels, right? The average person couldn't come within a factor of 6 of the size of the Army or the Marine Corps, right? Not within a factor of 6. People thought the military was much larger than it actually is. The main issue on which the authors of the book disagreed, by which I don't mean Jim and me, I mean Peter Fever and Rosa and Nadia Shadlow and Mac Owens, like the one we kept going round and round about was how much does it matter, either at high policy levels or in public support for the war. One of the best chapters in the book was written by Ben Wittes and Cody Poplin from Brookings, one of the founders of the Lawfare site. And they argued that public ignorance really matters because it creates a tendency to overreact to near-term stimulus, and it undercuts support for sustained long-term policies of the kinds that counterterrorism requires. And that struck me as quite an important insight and something I hadn't thought about before. The other, there are several kind of surprising things that came out of the data. One is that I imagined a sort of linear progression of progressivism or liberalism. That is, that young people would be more liberal in their attitudes about these things than older people. And it's not true, actually. One of the weirdest things we found, and I have since done research that corroborates this, is that people 18 to 29 are actually much more conservative about military issues than people 29 to 39, 39 to 49, 49 to 59. That, in fact, the attitudes of young Americans are closer to the attitudes of World War II veterans. And I don't yet know why this is. My guess is partly to them, the country's been at war their whole lives. And second of all, the economic uncertainty of coming onto the job market. I see we have students here nodding their heads, so maybe we're onto something. That having come onto the job market after the 2008 financial crisis, they are much more anxious about security in all sorts of dimensions than older Americans are. So there was a lot of weird, funny stuff in the data.
And also there's some data out there that says 85% of people in that demographic do not want to serve in the military. So,
well, that's actually fortunate because we only need about 3% of the people in that demographic.
But the problem is of the 15%, 75% of them can't qualify to be in the military.
The number is getting even closer, right?
And
well, that probably still works with the numbers.
And yet, a lot of Americans were disqualified from conscription in World War II because of malnutrition. Right? So obesity is our current scourge, but it's not. We set the standards. We could change the standards if we wanted broader inclusion. Or, as Rosa points out in her very good book, where we recruit also makes a big difference on these kinds of things. There are lots of variables. We don't need to treat demography as though it's fixed, because there are lots of things we could alter if we wanted to alter it. One last thing I should have said about the data, and I promise I will stop after this. Said, the cause of greatest concern to the people who were most concerned about civil-military relations was that support among the public for the American military has remained very high for at least 30 years. What has happened is the plummeting of support for other institutions in American life. And a lot of the contributors to the book were really worried that what they saw was greater influence accruing to the military at high levels of policy. Jim and I actually differed from almost everyone else on that because we came to it with a practical eye of not being able to think of any examples on which that was true. So, right, the service chiefs uniformly said it was the end of the world as we know it if sequestration went into effect. It didn't change a single congressional vote. Most of the leadership, and certainly 85% of infantrymen, opposed the policy change that permitted female assignment into infantry units. That didn't change anybody's view. We couldn't think of an example. So if anyone has one, I am open to them because I do think it's a really important point, but we just couldn't find the data. We shared the concern. We just couldn't think of instances in which the military's opposition actually had any effect on Congress, on the public, or on the White House.
Bill, let me ask you a question about your book. You went through the use of the military on the domestic front, a lot of good historical data in there. What's your concern today, if any? It does seem that when there is a catastrophe, people do want the military. They don't seem to have confidence in other organizations. And is that a concern? Is it a good thing, bad thing?
Well, it's a concern. It's I think more about planning and coordination than it is sort of an intrinsic concern about who it is that's going to save us or protect us when the chips are down. And I think Rosa's book and ours have much in common toward the end, coming around to the view that it's about not readjusting the civ-mil divide, but about taking into account the world we live in now and assigning roles and missions according to who can get things done well. So, part of the problem in homeland defense after 9/11 is roles and missions. It's the problem of a unified command, having separated commands in the military that are historic and traditional and hidebound, and the emergency response preparedness side of the House, DHS and others, who have a structure that would have military participation surely right at the center, but have it be part of a system that is run by some civilians who are expert in domestic response. And that has continued to create some disjuncture in exercising and training. It seems to me those problems ought to be able to be worked out. Last chapter of our book is one where we talk about black swans, the event that you can't predict, but that could be catastrophically bad, and what kind of role do we want the military to be prepared for in the event of the next black swan. 9/11 was a black swan. We don't know, of course, what a next one might be. It might be related to the themes of today's and tomorrow's conference, cyber, or connecting cyber more likely with some other threat phenomenon, kinetic or otherwise. Could be a public health emergency, could be terrible storms. And in any case, if things get really bad, we all Americans want the military to respond. It's the only institution that's able to keep us safe in times of great national stress. What we talk about in our book is the cautious embrace, because while Americans embrace that core function and protection that military provide, they know that at times in our history, the military have also threatened our liberties, often because of an exercise of decision-making prerogative by civilian leadership, not because of the initiative of military, but still the effect can be very harmful.
Charlie, can I just jump in on one thing before we leave this topic? This is something Kori and I have talked about before. I think it is important to ask ourselves as we lament things like, oh gosh, such a tiny percentage of the American population serves, and wow, the large majority of the American population knows absolutely zip about the military. To sort of ask ourselves, what kind of problem is this, and is it a problem that's unique to civil-military relations? And I think it's probably worth making 2 points about that. One is that the tiny percentage of Americans who serves, that's been true for most of our history. And, a separate note, I always find it so strange that we hearken back to World War II as sort of the golden era of civil relations in which everybody served and half of them were getting killed. That's worked out great. But that's anomalous, right? The conscription and a high percentage of population serving is really anomalous when you think of U.S. history. For most of our history, the military has been a tiny and professionalized and in many ways very separate from the overall population. And we didn't necessarily think it's a problem. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves, and I think there are several different ways to answer this, maybe we'll get into some of those during this discussion, is if it hasn't been a problem before, why do we suddenly think it's a problem? Is it a problem because something else has changed? Because it can't just be a problem because it's small. We'd have to say that something else is now different. And then I think the other point that's worth making, and Kori quite rightly says, nobody knows nothing about the military. They don't know if the Marine Corps has 10 people in it or 10 million. But nobody knows nothing about nothing in this country, right? I mean, this is not unique to the military. You poll Americans about anything. Yeah, you can't find Canada on the map. People say, I hate Obamacare, they should repeal it, just don't take away my Affordable Care Act. And you think, what? So there too. I think it's easy when we think about the level of ignorance on the average American has about the military, it's very high, and it's very easy for those of us who know something to go, that's terrible. But since that level of ignorance is pretty much across the board on all kinds of things that we might think, gee, it would be kind of nice if the American people knew something about this. Again, the same question. Is this a different problem than the broad problem that we might, as people who think of ourselves as educated people who care about the public good, we want an educated populace across the board? Or is this a deeper problem and a different problem, or is this just this is the civ-mil version of a problem that is really across the board, and therefore we don't need to care about it? And that too, I think that it's complicated, but I think that we have to sort of start by reminding ourselves that it's easy to think of this as this sort of unique moment with these unique problems, but it's not actually that unique.
Yeah, and the period of time when we had the most people in Congress with military experience was during the Vietnam War, and that didn't work out so well. So, Kori?
Just one point to add that comes through in the survey data from the book Warriors and Citizens is that while Americans genuinely know nothing, their judgment's actually pretty good. We walked through... Well, for example, we walked survey respondents through a series of questions about high policy making and civil military relations. Where does responsibility rest for the war effort? And in fact, despite not knowing the size of the Marine Corps within a factor of 6, the public's judgment was actually extraordinarily solid on the fact that the president bears responsibility for success of the war effort because they're the aggregators of our preferences. And on a whole host of questions where you provided information and asked for judgment, people's judgment was really terrific. So it's not clear that knowing nothing leads to bad outcomes.
Well,
and the Canadian borders,
my students will be very glad to hear that.
You can stop teaching now, Charlie.
Well, let's ask ourselves, are we in some sort of, as Dick Cone might put it, a crisis in civil military relations, or civil military relations where they want to be, or where we want, or is it just this is the way it is? And
no, we are not in a crisis. Levels of civil military friction are low by historical American standards. The last president fired 3 senior military commanders while the country was at war without a peep out of anyone, least of all the uniformed military who thought it was appropriate that the commanders were relieved. So that suggests to me a fundamentally healthy civil-military relationship. The only thing I worry about is that the public is comfortable with the military having a much broader and more politicized role than has been traditional for us. The kinds of things that you saw John Allen and Mike Flynn do during the campaign season, the American public actually thinks is great, but it's terrible for the military.
I agree with all the things you said. Can you say why?
Yes, because public affection and support for the military is derivative of considering the military an apolitical institution that cares about the public good. The more the military is associated with politicized actions, that the Secretary of Defense let the immigration ban be signed in the Hall of Heroes at the Pentagon was a terrible choice, because you can see why the politicians wanted it, right? It casts this in a national security and puts the most appreciated institution in American public life squarely behind it. It was a terrible thing to do for all of those reasons.
What about Flynn at the Republican convention in dress uniform?
Or John Allen marching out to martial music with a whole bunch, right? But the public clearly wants it. The only restraint on it happening is the professionalism of the military itself. And I think it's not surprising that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the prior chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, everybody in the military who thinks seriously about civil-military relations is anxious about this, and for good reason, because it makes the military's job harder. It will make it harder for presidents to trust that they are getting impartial advice. It will make it harder for the public to believe that you are a neutral institution that cares only about the public good. That's the one to be worried
What about retired generals who write a very interesting blog? Is that something wrong?
I want to quote Charlie. In fact, I remember some years back I was writing an article on the relationship that President Obama had with senior military leaders, and Charlie, I interviewed you for the article and said, Charlie, don't you think it's bad that we have all these generals who are being very vocal about their opinions about things like the Libya intervention and so on? And you said, beware the silence of the generals. The time to be worried.
So cool.
That was a great quote. He said the time president should really be worried is not when the generals are all yapping about them and complaining. It's when things get really quiet. That's when they're making a beeline behind you to Congress.
I still believe that. I think in terms of, but I totally agree, and you have to, I think through it, why it's so totally wrong for people to be at conventions on either side endorsing political candidates. That doesn't mean that, that retired or even active duty people shouldn't have opinions.
So I absolutely agree with that especially with such a small proportion of the American public having had military service, and as the survey data shows, knowing so little. In fact, what comes through in the data is that the American public has essentially outsourced judgment on these issues to the military. They want to hear military voices telling them, is this good, is this isn't? Is this not? And if you track support for the war effort, it doesn't dip when members of Congress start barking. It dips when the military does, right? What the public is looking for is for active and retired military folks to tell us whether we need to be worried, which is sort of fine. It's outsourcing. There is one problem, though. So I'm part of a group of academics who are writing a book on the Iraq surge in 2006. We interviewed President Bush. We interviewed everybody who was involved in it. And Peter Feaver, one of the most prominent civil military experts in the country, is also writing on the book. And he and I disagree hugely strongly on this because he and Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor and the White House Chief of Staff, said that they could not fire Secretary Rumsfeld, although they wanted to in the spring of 2006, 5-6, I can't remember.
Why?
Because retired military folks like Greg Newbold had been public in their criticism. And I find that genuinely shocking. That is that you would, and I'm sorry, I left out one important piece, which is the sitting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Pete Pace, agreed with that judgment, that you could not fire the Secretary of Defense because it would look like you were giving into the criticism of retired military people. And I actually interviewed Hadley on this because I thought it was so alarming. I asked him, these are retired military people. The civil military concern is about active duty politicization. And Steve said, the public doesn't make any difference, so we didn't either. And of course, that's terrible, right? The answer is the political leadership needs to educate the public about why it's okay to have informed citizens who are also veterans.
I think, Larry, I'd be interested to hear your view. I think the public can tell the difference between active and retired, and I think they're very respectful, but I don't think that they, and I bet you Greg Newbold would tell you the same thing.
So Greg Newbold did tell me the same thing.
So I'm really surprised that Peter thinks that.
What they looked at was not, it wasn't that the military said yes or no or whatever. It's still their job to decide who the Secretary of Defense is.
Yeah,
they didn't do their job. It wasn't that this person spoke out or this person said this. It's that political, and I'm not an expert at anything. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a cyberspace person. I'm certainly not an expert in your field. But I can tell you this, looking at it from the public point of view, it is the political arena's job to hire and fire people.
Yeah,
and if they had enough guts, they would have fired him, and they didn't.
We live in a country where
not to.
Not because somebody gave them advice or somebody says something public.
we live in a country where MacArthur was fired by Truman, and that would have been. It's mind-boggling to me that people would think that there would be this uprising in support of Rumsfeld if he it would not have been within the uniform ranks, I might add.
I'm a little bit less worried than Kori and Peter have been about the uptick in retired senior officers speaking out about political things. I think, yeah, you could draw some lines about like the convention in your uniform not okay, but I do think I worry a little bit that the unhealthy part of the widespread respect for the military is this kind of sacralization of the military, treating it as if it's an institution that is totally above and outside of politics, and you can't criticize anything, even if you happen to know something, which we've established you probably don't. But even if you did, you should shut up because nobody's allowed to ask questions or be critical. And I think that's really bad because the military is an institution that serves the nation, and we have to talk about it. And I think, if Clausewitz says war is politics by other means, what could be more fundamentally political, not partisan, but political, than decisions about who we kill, who we're willing to have die? Those are huge, huge, huge decisions, and I don't want senior retired military officers not to talk about those things precisely because the rest of us are pretty ignorant a lot of the time. I actually really want to know what people think. And I think you can draw some lines about partisanship, but I do worry that sometimes the concern takes the form of, even if these guys, think something is going to be a complete catastrophe and they have very sound reasons for thinking that they're not allowed to say anything, that seems like it's a real loss to the public discourse if we tell them that. Yeah.
Bill, did you have a point on that?
No, let's move on.
That was kind of boring.
Okay, well.
Violent agreement is what we've got going.
One of the things, and I'd really be interested, and Kori and I exchanged some things on this, the whole notion that Jim Mattis, there's a statutory ban on him. You can be a convicted felon and there's no statutory ban on that. You can be, you know, an alien, you know, you can be any.
Are you running for office, Charlie?
Because he
That would
did
be the
figure out
last.
the law on that, didn't he?
But I just don't because to me it sends a message that if you've served in uniform, you're somehow suspect in terms of, you know, your loyalty to the country. Ergo, we have to have this statutory prohibition.
Yes, so I agree that, so Thucydides in Book 6 of the Peloponnesian Wars
I was just going to say
sets
that.
up,
This is why I love being on panels with you, Kori.
sets up the Athenian debate about whether to invade Sicily. And the reasonable position, the conservative position, we have not consolidated our existing territory. This is going to be hard. We're not up for it. Let's digest what we've swallowed before we move on. That entirely reasonable position that Nicias lays out gets trumped by Alcibiades because he is a general. And that's what leads Athens to its destruction. That the public, as Rosa is suggesting, was unduly deferential to a military man because of his stature, not because of the merit of his contribution.
They didn't have civilian control.
They were all civilians, but they were unduly deferential to a military man's arguments about it. So both roads lead to perdition. There is no substitute for judgment. And we do our military as much a disservice by treating them like comic book heroes, like people who don't have individual motivations and that deserve to be scrutinized as all the rest of us, as we do when we treat them like, wow, it's such a pity you guys didn't have employable characteristics and had to go into military service, right? John Kerry's famous 2004 line. So we need to actually...
Or become law professors. I mean, it's really sad what happens to people.
I actually did read Thucydides, but this is the problem with the Jesuit education. I read it one time during the summer. I went back and told my Jesuit professor. He sniffed at me and he said, "You probably read it in English." You read it in the original Greek, you're like a lightweight in the Jesuit world. But you know, I think that what is it about civil-military relations and civilian control that we're really after? Are we afraid that there's going to be a coup? Or are we afraid that there's going to be, you know, is it the physical fear, or do we just...
Don't mention that word. I'm very sensitive about it.
Which one?
Coup.
Yeah.
So I will tell you all, if you are not readers of Rosa's column, which you should be, that a couple of weeks ago she had some fun and reckless games by making the case about Article 25 impeachment, and then had to endure a really dangerous couple of weeks of death threats and a lot of violent backlash coming on social media. So she's justifiably sensitive on this subject. What I was saying is your wheelhouse was the first part of the question, which is what are we really worried about this? Because academics are worried about the military being too influential. And I think most policy people think the military is of questionable influence on a lot of these issues and might deservedly serve the Republic by having more.
Well, this is something, Bill, I think very much links into the themes of your book as well. You know, one of the things that sort of struck me in in all the discussions about, well, does Trump have too many generals, and isn't this bad for civilian control of the military? There's this rash of op-eds about how terrible this is for civilian control of the military, and my reaction was wow, you know, don't we have bigger things to worry about right now? And are, you know, and sort of saying, let's push ourselves here as on every issue. Let's push ourselves to ask exactly the question you just asked, Charlie. What is it that we think our notion of civilian control of the military is for. What does it do? What work is it supposed to be doing? And does it in fact do the work that we think it does? And you know, I would make the argument that increasingly our conception of civilian control of the military is, as I put it, sort of a rule of aesthetics at this point, not a rule of ethics, because it doesn't do any real work anymore. It has become something as superficial as people wearing uniforms or who recently wore uniforms shouldn't be in certain kind of jobs just because. And we have this fantasy, which is actually, I think, not neutral, but a dangerous fantasy, that somehow that protects us from something bad, some threat to democracy, and it in fact distracts us from the many real threats to democracy that are out there that have absolutely nothing to do with civil-military relations one way or the other. You know, and I think go back to, you know, you're more of a historian than I am, Bill, but going back to thinking, well, okay, why do we have this notion of civilian control in the military in the first place? And I think it's pretty straightforward that the framers had a very, very strong fear of concentrations of power. And that's across the whole U.S. Constitution, the constitutional system. That concern was paramount in all kinds of ways, that they didn't want any one group, party, faction, you name it, to have excessive influence on government outcomes and policies. And in 1789, people with weapons had the capacity to completely capture the state. That's much less true now, partly because the military is large and because it is not homogeneous. It's also true because there are other levers of power that the framers of the Constitution could never have dreamed of, in terms of economic power, in terms of cyber issues, that the ability to coerce and control and capture the state and its resources and destroy lives is not any longer, just as it is not an exclusive monopoly of states, it's also not the exclusive monopoly of the military anymore. And so it seems to me that at this point in time, that this sort of fairly formalistic notion of civilian control of the military doesn't capture all the ways in which power can now be concentrated and resources can be captured that are really, really dangerous, and instead kind of replaces this sort of very superficial set of rules for anything that actually accomplishes anything.
Nor does it capture the ambiguities that remain in those relationships. You know, sometime when you have a moment, Google Ronald Reagan's first national security strategy, 1982. President Reagan said, the primary purpose of our national security is to protect democratic institutions and our Constitution. Full stop. Think about that. So the military's purpose is to protect our democracy and to protect our fundamental law. That's very simple, but it's very profound. It can be implemented in a way that becomes quixotic or creates tensions, because we can exercise security in such a way that we threaten liberties. That's happened in our history. And in taking special efforts to protect our security, to protect our freedoms, we might undermine our security. There's that tension in that relationship that's never going to go away. And our fundamental laws, as all the law-trained people in the room know, were purposely written to be open-textured and ambiguous in certain respects. Civilian control was cemented very heavily, and that's for the reasons that Rosa just mentioned. Remember the Declaration of Independence, the famous phrase from there is that the king had rendered the military independent of and superior to the civil power. I believe I'm quoting. Independent of and superior to the civil power. There's a reason to revolt, and revolt we did, and so we put the system into place. But there remain ambiguities in the relationship between civilian and military authority, with the commander-in-chief making sure that it doesn't run off the rails altogether. I think in contemporary times, the ambiguities are not serious. I think there's no crisis. I think a good thing for the lawyers in the room is that a lot of the difficulties that we're facing now and likely to face in the future can be averted, at least in part, by good planning. Planning. Get it figured out in advance, assign some roles and missions. Don't talk about the civ-mil divide or who's wearing a uniform and who's not, but figure out who's good at what, and when the proverbial blank hits the fan, who's going to respond in what different ways and how you're going to coordinate. And I think that's a fairly efficacious way to move forward.
Let me bring up something kind of related to the other purpose of the conference. You know, there's now every military guy and person is on Facebook, and there's blogs and so forth, and you read more and more. It's easier to access what a range of people in the military are thinking. You know, it's out there beyond just in the journals and so forth. And one of the things that I've noticed recently is there's been a couple of articles about, and you wrote about this, about officers thinking that they had a moral responsibility to disobey. The one I'm thinking of was on lawfare recently. It was an Army JAG who wrote it, selective conscientious objection. And then there was another one on just security where he was basically talking about, you know, this moral. But each example that they used was something that was probably an illegal order, but it didn't seem to be recognized why we have that neutrality in there. In other words, that's not because there are some moral convictions that are not benign. They're I don't know. It seems I'm surprised to be reading this from not just some crazy two-striper. It's, you know, from people who you would think would have thought it through more.
Yeah. So we know what the rule is. If the order's unlawful, you don't enforce it. Otherwise, you do, or you're at risk of losing your job.
But I think you wrote a piece on this, Rosa, that basically says, and I think it's true, don't count on the military, not because, you know, if you look back through history, you know, Obama gave an illegal order, the Gitmo transfer that the GAO said was illegal, the military executed. You know, you suggested vote vote about the order giver if you're concerned about this.
So, the historian Joseph Ellis, in his introduction to Founding Brothers, has this wonderful passage in which he argues that we do a disservice to the Founding Fathers by putting them on pedestals and carving them out of marble. And when I read the piece about don't expect the military to save us, I had the same reaction, which is that we need to save ourselves, right? The reason not to carve the Founding Fathers out of marble is that if they were all perfect geniuses, then we have no responsibility to make similarly brave choices, to make similarly principled choices. It exculpates us from responsibility. And a lot of the Jim Mattis will be our savior. You know, I'm a Mattis partisan, but it is wrong to expect to invest in the military the responsibility that all of us as citizens bear. It's unfair to them. And even if it's meant out of respect, it is also a way of fobbing off the responsibility that we bear as citizens.
But I think, I mean, to more directly answer your question, Charlie, you know, here too, I think the military is not that different from anybody else. We all face times in our lives, or many of us will face times in our lives where your deepest moral intuitions will be in contradiction to something that you have been asked to do, and you have to make a highly personal decision, which is, do I risk losing my job, offending people who I respect, maybe even going to prison, or do I just go along? And I don't actually think that there is anything unique, in a sense, about military duties. I mean, the law is clear. The law that governs other situations may vary in certain ways, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. I mean, I completely take your point that for everyone who finds, it's easy to come up with a hypothetical in which we're all really sympathetic to a military officer disobeying orders, even if they're not illegal, but that they're simply morally abhorrent. It's easy for us to come up with those hypotheticals. You know, I mean, I suppose I can imagine a hypothetical in which something the president has now disavowed, in which the military, National Guard are ordered to round up immigrants or something, and someone saying, that may be a legal order, but I can't do it. I won't do it. You know, I'm just not going to. And we might think, yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. It's also easy to come up with hypotheticals where they're saying, you know, take some controversial issue, abortion rights or something like that, or gay rights, where we have a military person. I refuse to work with a gay service member. I'm not doing it. And I think your point is that you don't want to have too much of a carve out for saying, okay, it's fine to disobey orders if they cut against your deepest moral views, because some people have deep moral views with which any one of us may profoundly disagree and think are horrible and immoral views. But I don't think that the situation for that individual is any different, right? I mean, if you believe that abortion is murder, then you do have a moral duty to protest it. If you believe that abortion rights are vital to saving the lives of women, then you do have a moral duty to stand up for that. You know, and that either way, you know, you have to be willing to take the consequences.
I think that's a good point. I think, you know, everybody has to have a plan B in life, because you can find yourself at a place that, you know, you just don't want to be. It's not, other people aren't doing anything illegal, but it's not something that you want to do. Bill, do you have any thoughts on this looking forward? The black swan that you've talked about is the cyber event.
We can imagine. Panel this morning, three of the panels already today have touched on where some of these issues might come together. You can imagine a scenario going forward where, for example, you might have ISIS-inspired continuation of small but lethal kinetic attacks here in the United States, the San Bernardino, Orlando type of attack, where it persists, perhaps during this period of transition where we don't have a lot of leadership in place in a lot of the important positions in government. And imagine while this is going on and escalating, terrorists are in the United States. Some maybe have been injured or killed, maybe some have been apprehended, but others are continuing to foment these attacks. Imagine at the same time that we start to experience a electric grid assault that pairs up conventional attacks on system components like power lines and transformers with cyber intrusions into the system itself. And we have rolling blackouts moving from west to east, starting in Kori's neighborhood and coming in this way, with critical infrastructure beginning to fail. What's the military do? So it's
planning again, I guess.
Yes, it's planning, but it's in part a question that was raised this morning about the different players in the cyber world, the civilian and military, which would have responsibility in a situation like this, and about the sort of ramifications of the kind of disturbances that would be going on in the United States in the event you have the attacks accompanied by a hit on the electric grid. If it got bad, you've got law enforcement problems, civil disturbance that civilian law enforcement may not be able to manage on their own.
Let me throw something very...
There's a supporting example from the Eisenhower administration.
Yes.
Where the Chief of Staff of the Army wanted, because of the Berlin crisis, felt he had a legitimate case to take to the Congress for higher end strength in the Army. And in the National Security Council's debate about it, because it would have blown a great big hole in President Eisenhower's budget, Eisenhower told the Chief of Staff of the Army that Eisenhower, should be impeached if in a war he reinforced U.S. troops in Europe, because the American Army would be needed in Baltimore and other major cities to restore order after the nuclear exchange with the Soviets.
Well, that's a good example, I think, especially for the young law students in the audience, how important it is really to study history, because to have if God forbid the Black Swan happened, it would be good to know these other historical contexts. Let's open it up to questions. I do have a couple more questions, but Dr. Curtis?
I have a question regarding, and I'd like for the panel to give me their thoughts on it. Sorry, I'm used to hollering at midshipmen. Okay, In 1957, Samuel Huntington wrote his book on the theory of civil-military relations. And what impressed me about that, the environment in which he actually asked it was at the height of the Cold War when his book was published. That book is still in publications today. And the major part of it that I really liked was his definition of the military ethics, which suggests to me that the military has a different approach to understanding man's nature in society and so forth. And that ethics, military ethics, I would argue that at that time, the military was held to a so-called higher standard. What's the relevance of his book, published in 1957, to today's threat environment and today's environment itself, given that it's still published?
So there are kind of two fundamental texts for American civil-military relations: Samuel Huntington's Soldier in the State and Morris Janowitz's book. And they posit very different types of civil-military relationships. Huntington believed that, as you suggest, the military had unique demands, but also unique virtues that a broad, progressive American society didn't have, and that therefore deserved to be kept separate, and that political and connect at the top, right? Janowitz envisioned a much more organic connection between the two, thought it was much healthier, worried a lot more about the separation of the military from society than Huntington worried about. I love it that you bring up that Huntington wrote the book in 1957, because in 1957, the way the visual that most people had of the American military was an airborne division forcibly integrating schools in the American South. And it's hugely, wonderfully relevant, but it also had to be done because the National Guard units wouldn't do it in the South. So where I'm headed with this is that I'm not sure that the military's ethics are unique and different, although the circumstances they are often put in by our political leadership and by virtue of their profession are different, and in some cases more pungent than the moral circumstances the rest of us navigate in everyday life. I personally think that Huntington's notion of keeping the military separate from society isn't a danger of a military coup. It's a danger of mutual incomprehension that Rosa talked about. And that I think with a very small force relative to our broad society, a professional force and a volunteer force, I think indifference and incomprehension is a bigger concern than Huntington had. Anybody else have a view on this?
The only thing I would add to that is I mean, I asked earlier the question, why should we care if only a tiny percentage of Americans serves in the military and fewer people know anything about it? I think that there is a reason to care now that is different from reasons that is different from the past, and that is that we live in a moment where at the very same time we've seen two trends kind of going in opposite directions. One trend being a diminishing number of Americans with any particular connection to the military, spouse, children, parent who served, et cetera, and so greater separation of the military as a human institution from civilian society, even as the other trend has been the expansion of the military's role into many domains we've traditionally thought of as military. And I don't think that expansion, excuse me, as civilian, thank you. And I don't think that expansion comes about for any particular sinister conspiracy reason. It's just look at the issue we've been talking about today, cyber. Boy, how do you decide what cyber task is a military task or a civilian task? This just doesn't look like stuff we're used to thinking about. And the same is true for so many issues and as we ask the military to do more and more things that, unlike in the sort of Huntingtonian vision, you can't separate neatly into civilian lanes and military lanes when the role of the military expands at the same time that fewer and fewer people know anything much about it. That's when I think you start getting problems, and that's when I think that any theory of civil-military relations that makes the assumption that it is fairly straightforward to say, oh, that's a civilian job, that's a military job, oh, well, that's strategy, that's execution, that all of those distinctions have really broken down in a lot of ways.
One other example, I think Kori's a very good example of that, the military responding to desegregated schools in the South, is an occasion to remember that the impetus for that decision was civilian leadership, this time enforcing a judicial decree. You think back not much more than a decade earlier, the military also helped enforce Japanese-American internment in the West during World War II, again pursuant to civilian leadership and judicial oversight through the highest court in the United States. So good and bad decisions can be made across the spectrum, and they weren't made by the military leadership, they were made by civilians, and the military implemented them.
We have a couple questions from the overflow room from our UNC students, and Katie Cusack, who's my editor over there for my article, or one of the editors, she asks, if the military were expected to operate on U.S. soil in response to natural disaster, the Black Swan, how do you think that might change the civil-military relationship, if at all?
Shouldn't change it at all. The questions again are what are the triggers and what legal bounds would there be on their participation? As many people in this room know, there's ample statutory authority that's been fleshed out by regulation to allow for military responses to natural disasters or others in the United States. Stafford Act, Insurrection Act, we could quote U.S. code here, but I don't think we need to. Lots of authority.
I think it has been an enormously positive factor in the public's attitude about the military that the only thing they are ever used for in the domestic United States in recent years is firefighting, disaster relief. But if you actually, if you have rolling blackouts and the military is preventing people from getting food for their children, or like you can think of horrible things that would actually have a negative effect on this relationship, but they're all extreme, right?
Bruce Willis in a bad movie.
There we go.
Another question from Bethany Bourne from UNC, and basically, she asked, do you think that the attitude about younger people, I think she's referring, it has more to do with the way the war is waged and the justification rather than the length of the war? I think somebody said that, well, this is all they've known.
I don't. Because I don't think that many let me sift the various factors. First, there's the fact that 18 to 29-year-olds of earlier generations, as Rosa pointed out, would have been forced into military service. But these young people are the age of the people doing the fighting on our behalf. So there's a natural affinity that, because of age, that I think others might not have. In general, though, I think it's the fact that they're reading newspapers and they know somebody from high school who went in the service. I don't think it's the higher, more refined judgment about, if we had a strategy for fighting ISIS that didn't play out across a 7-year time frame and allow for the radicalization of the people we wanted fighting on our side, that it would be different in attitudes about the American military for 18 to 29-year-olds, by which I mean to say her question is much more sophisticated than the judgment that most 18 to 29-year-olds bring to the issues.
Do you have any? Sir.
The vast majority of domestic disaster response has come, military response has come from the National Guard, and we have a proliferation of National Guard cyber units. And so I wonder if, do you see people thinking through what a governor and a state's role is with regard to military cyber response? I don't know if we've gone very far in that regard yet, but any concerns or thoughts?
And let me piggyback on that question. Do you think that the common person can tell the difference between the Guard and the regular Army?
Well, it depends, right? In many cases, the members of the Guard are your neighbors, and you see them at the grocery store. So if they're suddenly wearing green uniform, you still see their faces, and you know
I do wonder if that's really true anymore with the Guard. It'd be interesting to hear from somebody in the Guard, because I know in the Air Guard, people, you might live in California and you're in the Delaware
be
Guard.
deployed elsewhere, right? So maybe, maybe not. The other part of the question, state cyber, the federal system does further complicate the planning problem, doesn't it? So you not only have these separations.
In every area of
every area of the world.
I mean, response usually comes under the command of a governor.
That's right. And that's the default position. The draft executive order last week that apparently was changed about immigration enforcement would have had Guard involvement in law enforcement subject to the governor's control. In those 11 states, I believe it was identified in that draft order and was subsequently changed. So
I would bet $4,000 the governor of California would refuse
I
that.
think so. There's, further toward the secession movement.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of exercising that's been going on about that, the very thing that you ask about, and I think there have been some hiccups, so far as I can tell from reading in the public domain, that those exercising efforts haven't always gone smoothly so far, but that's the answer. Train and exercise, and make sure the governor and their staffs, the people that are responsible for response in their states, are brought up to speed. I think that's I'm in New York, and I think they're pretty good shape. They work this stuff all the time, but it's very uneven.
We'll have one more question. The gentleman all the way in the back. I think it's gentleman. Yeah, there we go.
About 20 minutes.
Yes, my name is Grant Smithson. I think the biggest black swan that I remember, and maybe for most of us, when I was 14 years old in October of 1962, and it was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that may have been the most quintessential example of there being a civilian commander-in-chief, because my recollection, or at least my reading on it, is that the military people, I know that Maxwell Taylor was in favor of invading Cuba, and Curtis LeMay was, being Curtis LeMay, wanted to bomb them into submission. And,
Well, I think we are running out of time, but I do think we get the question, and I think the
don't
point.
you think that is the quintessential example of why, of the separation of having commander-in-chief? You were talking about a cosmetic connection now, but isn't that the real purpose of having the civilian control of the military?
Yes.
I think Elliot Cohen would agree with you. I mean, his whole book is on that point.
Yeah. No, we elect our civilian leaders in order to determine how much time, effort, blood, and treasure to put to the war efforts. And every American president has had an answer that's less than complete, right? Lincoln didn't stop the other business of the country. He didn't conscript every young man in the country. We elect civilian leaders for their judgment about what we as a broad society with many interests that often conflict do. And they, as Jim Mattis likes to say, and said repeatedly when we were working on this book, that it's the president's job to ignore their military leadership when it doesn't meet what the president's broad perspective on what the country needs is.
Well, thank you very much. That'll be the last word. Ladies and gentlemen, be sure to buy the books. Be sure to buy the books. They're excellent. And